Welcome back, everyone. This is the second plenary Leaders Conversation. Welcome back. Our topic is, as you know already, because you've been working hard in the workshops, equal societies. And this is the topic that we would like to address in the next hour. I'm very pleased to have a very good panel on this topic that I would like to briefly introduce to you before we start right into the debate, and reminding you also of the translation devices that are available, even though I think mostly will be in English. Let us welcome to my very left Sven Mikser, who is the leader of the Social Democratic Party from Estonia. Welcome to you. Sitting next to Sven Mikser is Karin Jemtin. She is the Secretary General of SAP from Sweden. Welcome. To my left is sitting Slatko Lagumja. Warm welcome to you as well. Joining us from Bosnia-Herzegovina, the leader of the Social Democratic Party. Welcome. To my right, continuing with Juan Fernando López Aguilar, the head of the PSOE delegation in the European Parliament. Welcome on the panel.
Thank you.
Followed by Kaisa Penny, ECOSI President. A warm welcome to you. And last but not least, to my very right, Rory Quinn, who is the Minister of Education of the Irish Labour Party. Thank you very much for joining us. Very good. And Jan helped me put together, and we're going to proceed as we did in the morning. Jan helped me put together a set of questions that are essentially based on what you discussed in the workshops after the lunch break. And again, I think it is a great idea just to feed them to our leaders here on the panel, and they will take them on and respond. Just a little housekeeping information. The fact that Mr. Lopez is leaving earlier is not out of disinterest, just the opposite. He has to go back to engage in his home country, just for you to know, and we will include you in the discussion up to the point when you have to leave. But I would like to start, because we discussed in the workshops a very, very wide range of issues related to the question of equal society, such as health, such as pensions, education, equality for youth, and really, really wide range, social housing. So I thought it would be really interesting to hear from Rory Quinn, who was in the education workshop, to hear a little bit your impressions. You know, what was the kind of atmosphere? What did you discuss? What were main points? Just to give us a snapshot of what was happening there.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank all the participants and the activists who've been at the various workshops. The workshop that I was at was chaired very skillfully by Luca Scarpiello, and we had participants from the Swedish MEP, the Falcons, Karina Uffert, who is from the European Student Union, and Gina Ebner from European Lifelong Learning. We were all asked to make a brief presentation, and then there were a number of questions from the floor. It was about 30 people plus, good engagement. There's a general recognition that education really is a key pillar of social democratic philosophy. Northern Europe tends to be a more equal society than Southern Europe, including Ireland. And in my society, wealth and power and privilege is concentrated in a small section of our society. But talent and intelligence and creativity is, as far as we know, genetically, is equally distributed across the range of our society. And therefore, from a social democratic and socialist perspective, if we want to achieve a truly liberated and complete society, we have to unlock the doors to education and ensure that people participate effectively and properly. So our discussions really were taking that philosophical point of view for granted, and then asking ourselves, how well is the system working? What do we do about boys who don't perform so well in the school system as girls? What do we do about the preparation for education into the workplace? How do we mix vocational education and academic education, where in some of our countries that division is quite clear? And should there be a cost barrier into third level education? Should income be the determinant of participating in third level education, or should there be no fees whatsoever? And yet education is not free, it has a cost. How do we share that cost? And how do students and subsequently young adults, when they get into the labour market, how do they make a contribution back into society? That's a brief summary of what we discussed, but there were some very good questions. In all, I think about 9 to 10 people raised questions and participated, and I certainly found it very useful.
Thank you very much also for giving an impression of how the workshop went. And the group actually gave us a quote saying, Europe needs a vision, and this vision needs to start from an open and inclusive education for all. We discussed in a number of workshops also the inclusion, exclusion aspect on various levels, and I would like to put this to Zlatko Lagumja. You know, in your country, certainly there are a number of levels in terms of ethnicity, also certainly in terms of participation in the labor force, a number of questions related to inclusion and exclusion. So what is your take on the inclusion-exclusion problem?
Well, I'm coming from the country which is known as a divided country, as a country in which actually policies of segregation, of exclusions of the people, or division of the people along ethnic, racial, or religious lines, were actually covering the divisions among us, we were basically speaking economic divisions. And I think that what we are promoting compared to another grouping is something which is inclusive society, a shared society, a society in which, cohesive society, if we can put it that way. It is a stable and safe society. It is where all those living there and feel like they're at home. Sometimes we are saying that we are for fairness and inclusion, and they are for growth, which leads to inclusion. I think exclusion. What I think is actually there's and we should be much stronger and much louder about fairness and inclusion actually being resulting with the growth and with efficient and effective economy. Because there's plenty of data in my country, in Europe, and global data, which are showing actually that if you take relevant studies, World Bank studies, which are not actually our favorite institutions sometimes, but they are showing their estimates and their research are showing that even data that they collected and evaluated, let's say for last decade, are saying that the countries with social trust and cohesion, inclusion, actually had about 18% increase in their GDP over the, let's say, past 5 years of the last decade, compared to countries in which they had low levels of social trust, where they had exclusion as a major factor, and the data shows that there were societies with 0% of growth. And you can have a lot of data which are showing actually that exclusion is excellent way to decline in economic sense, and inclusion is actually doing something completely different, going in completely different direction. So my point is that we should use more their argument to destroy their visions, which are definitely not our visions.
I would like to put to Mr. Lopez, because also, you know, it is very much on your heart as you're traveling back to your country, I'm sure, the question of inclusion, especially inclusion into the workforce, inclusion of young population, massive unemployment rates. So what is your response? What is your concept as you're working towards improving the situation?
Thank you. Yes, we had a very lively debate in our panel with active contributions from the participants, and the point we would like to make is, yes, discrimination is again on the rise, not for the first time in European history, and it's our concern, because yes, we are in a crisis, in a huge crisis, and as usual, a crisis is an opportunity to bring about your best, but also your worst. And there are some worse reactionary forces taking place and occupying the field in the contemporary circumstances we are contemplating now. One of them, of course, relates to the fact that the crisis is not only financial or economic. It turned out to be social, destroying jobs, and political, affecting our values in a major offensive against our values. And the political impact of the crisis has meant that jingoism is on the rise, petty nationalism is on the rise, the instinct to relift barriers between member states is also on the rise, and we have to fight back. We have discussed this whole array of issues over the panel, and the conclusion being this: we cannot tolerate scapegoating. We have to be intolerant against scapegoating. It affects the Muslims, and for that matter, we all are. It affects the Roma, and for that matter, we all are. It affects people on sexual gender orientation, and for that matter, we're all concerned. And it affects, of course, the old-rooted grounds for discrimination, which are social. The labor market, excluding people, and we must remind throughout the crisis that it's also about fundamental rights which are enshrined in the European Charter for Fundamental Rights. It's about the Lisbon Treaty principles, it's about social cohesion, it's about social integration, it's about including diversity, which means united in diversity. That's the motto of the European Union, not disunited before adversity, against the adversity we're facing now. So we have to tackle this issue, and I had an opportunity to explain that in the European Parliament, we S&D, we are doing that. And we are setting up a divisive line, a cleavage between the right and the left. We have noticed that when it comes to discussing the integration of labor across Europe, and that's a response, that's an answer to your question. Yes, there is a difference when it comes to setting the line before the single market, before the single permit for foreign workers, before the integration of seasonal workers, before the integration of intra-corporate transfers. The labor market takes a very strong signal, a very strong message that equal rights for all is still a principle, and it's still good grounds to fight for being proud of being European. I heard Yorgos Papandreou once again making the point that he was proud to be European. We should all fight back for the Europe we want to win back if we are to be proud of being European. Thank you.
This is your applause. I would like to have a brief follow-up as you touched upon the issue of mobility as well. And specifically looking at the Spanish example, with a lack of perspective of young Spaniards in your country, are you worried about them going to find work in Germany, going to find work elsewhere? Where does this leave your country? And by the way, I just realized this morning we sorted out in the leaders panel the economy without the Germans, as I mentioned them now, which was quite interesting. But going back to the example of Spain, where do you see this? How do you give young Spaniards hope that are out in the streets and saying, essentially, our societies are failing to deliver on the promise of us getting jobs? We don't want to stay, we go elsewhere.
Yes, we Spanish Socialists, we have been in governments for the last almost 80 years, and we have made a difference. We have made a difference removing barriers of discrimination against women, fighting gender violence, against religious minorities, promoting religious equal rights, against people that had been discriminated against on the basis of sex or gender, promoting equal rights for LGBT. And we have made also a difference by promoting equal opportunities for workers through an equality law, promoting the massive incorporation of women to the job market, and taking advantage of the good side of the cycle, the bright side of the moon that came to an end with this huge crisis, which has been, of course, the explosion of the bubble of the housing industry in Spain, costing some million jobs in Spain, yes, and young people have been paying the price, but there has been a social policy that has also made a difference, always with the resistance and with the active opposition by the right-wingers, by the conservatives in Spain. We have supported young people to be promoted in the educational system, enhancing scholarships and grants and aids for emancipation, and subsidies for those who have been losing their jobs throughout the crisis. And of course, we are concerned of the high unemployment rate among our youngsters, among the young people. We share their anger. They have qualified themselves as indignados, but I have been campaigning with a message. Yes, we feel your pain, we feel your anger, it's yours, because our sons and daughters have lost their jobs too. But let me tell you, you can be really angry when you see the difference that the right-wing government is going to make, cutting rights and subsidies with despise and contempt with all of the achievements that we have.
What's your response to the young that say, well, we need an improvement now, quick? What's your kind of short-term response to make them more confident?
We have done everything in our capacity while in government in order to promote jobs and job opportunities for young people. We have done our best to preserve the educational investment as a #1 priority: innovation, learning, long life training and long life learning for the youngsters, and direct subsidies for them to have an opportunity to establish them freely and maybe set up a home of their own or a family of their own with equal opportunities for men and women for the first time in history. That's been our message. But of course, we pay the toll. It's a fact. It's a fact that this collapse of a whole sick pattern for growth based on the housing industry has come to an end, and this calling for a whole renewal of the social and economic strategy for the Spanish social democracy and for the European social democracy as a whole.
Thank you, and let me put this to Sven Mixer, this question, because it was addressed in one of the workshops, which was dealing with the question of a social stability pact for Europe, which essentially addresses those questions as well. And what the quote is from this workshop, don't we need a more social than a stability pact? And it's formulated as a question, so I'm going to directly put the question to you, Sven Mixer. Do you agree that we need a double strategy? Minimum standards, but also in order to avoid social dumping, every country has to spend a certain percentage of its GDP on education, health, and social services. So what's your answer to that?
I think that when we are speaking about whether we need more a growth and stability pact or a social stability pact, then in a way it's sort of chicken and egg dilemma, whether you need a chicken first in order to have an egg, or you need to have an egg in order to have a chicken. And I think that it's very nice at a time when social democrats and socialists are in opposition in most European countries. It's very, very nice for a while to be in front of an audience who are already converts, and it's very pleasant to talk slogans which we know to be right. But I think at such a time in a plenary hall with no reporters and no ideological enemies present, we should be very frank and honest among ourselves and actually try to analyze why we are facing such a difficult task of converting our voters to things that we know to be right. I think that we have, when we are saying that the current crisis has been caused by the greed of the financial industry. We know this to be the case, but actually we are also facing a very powerful counter-narrative by conservatives who are saying that this crisis has been caused by unsustainably lavish social policies, which have forced some of our governments to excessive borrowing. And how do we fight this? Well, in Estonia, we found the most recent surveys have found that at a time when the popularity of the Estonian Social Democratic Party is going up, that we have very strong support among the bottom layers of the social ladder and also towards the top. So these are people who feel the pain, who feel the squeeze in their everyday lives. And there are people who personally do not feel a squeeze, but actually who are concerned for the overall course of the society. Somewhere in the middle, there are those pro-status quo people who are very receptive to the conservative or liberal talk that, well, thanks to our policies, you still have your jobs. you still can somehow manage and afford your housing. So how do we address these pro-status quo forces? I think here this need for the Social Stability Pact comes into play. Basically, we need to say very clearly to those people that we have even more of a strategic long-term vision than the conservatives. That it's not true when they say that in order to be able to afford social policies, responsible social policies, you need to have growth first. We say it's impossible to have growth unless you first spend money on responsible social policies, including education, including housing, and so on and so forth.
The question then really is, isn't it, how much room for maneuver is there, especially when you're facing the fact that austerity is imposed from the outside? How social can you still be? This is, I think, a very critical aspect. Knowing that also Karin would have to leave at some stage, I would like to bring you in, and we're going to follow up on this question. You see, the issues that were discussed in the workshops are so wide, we can't cover everything adequately on the panel, and forgive us for that. So we're jumping in a little bit, and I would like to go back to the question of the social services that were addressed in the workshop, amongst others, that looked at building an inclusive society through quality social services and decent work. The quote I got from that workshop that I would like to put to you, Karin, is an inclusive society is a more competitive society. This requires long-term investments in poverty-proof minimum income, quality social services, decent work and quality employment. So in the back of our mind we have there's probably not much room for maneuver, but what's your experience? What's your response to this?
It's a very, very wide topic which was taken up in the seminar, and to say the least important. We have to invest in social services to be able to have high growth, and as was pointed out too, is very corresponding souls of good development. I would like to just stress some few things, and the one is that we have to get close and regular ties with the trade unions to work with having a good workplaces, but also fair working conditions for all workers at all levels, being it blue collar or white collar workers. We have to have good working conditions. But not only to create good working conditions, also to have the possibility to have a more a society where people are protected and, understand me rightly, not jobs. In Sweden there is an approximate of 400,000 jobs being lost every year, but also approximately 400,000 jobs being created every year. And one of the biggest challenges is, of course, to create a situation where government at local or national level has the ability of supporting lifelong learning, good schooling, education for young people and old people, but also to support with unemployment benefit systems which works. And one thing which was pointed out in the seminar which was the seminar on social housing, affordable housing, so that people can actually move to where the jobs are actually being created. That works for the young people, but also for elderly people who wants to get back into the labor market. So, some of the areas I wanted to point out.
Well, you're speaking about your country where you are in a quite comfortable situation, having set up probably many of the answers already. What's your advice to those under stress that have to really come up with some very quick answers because austerity is felt immediately, people are suffering immediately? What's your kind of encouragement?
That there is only one way forward, and that is to work hard. I was about to say, we had a very domestic economic crisis in the 90s. It was a very deep crisis in Sweden. We had for not a long period, but for a short period, we had interest rates of 500% actually. It was a real economic domestic crisis. What we did then was, it was a very tough situation for the, at the time, social democratic government. We had to make cuts in all sectors in public services, being it daycare centers, schools, or unemployment benefits. That had to be done. We had to cut down on spending to lower our debt ratio. And that is what we are living on today, or that is what the Conservative government is living on today. A sound financial situation in Sweden, thanks to a very, very tough, very, very tough policies in the mid-90s. What I want to say with that is that to be able to create trust in society, politicians have to take the tough decisions when they are needed. We have to be able to take the tough decisions when they are needed, but never forgetting that we cannot cut down too much, I was about to say, on social services, because the gaps in society cannot widen. Look at Iceland. They have started a track forward without widening the gaps in Iceland, on Iceland.
Yes, go ahead. There's time for that. Kajsa, knowing that many of those questions are on your mind anyway, and certainly on your heart, we talked also in one workshop, and I want to give this to the room here because there was a workshop addressing the overall climate, which is increasingly about hatred, which makes it even more difficult to address those questions. And I know that you were part of that workshop as well, or being familiar with the question. So if you could just, and the quote that I got, "Challenging hate across Europe," was the workshop. And the quote that I got from that workshop is, "Discrimination is on the rise. We must unite together and value diversity of all humans and not be sidetracked by fear and hate. Why is racism not taught in school? What can the PES do to fight with racism?" I mean, yes, unite together, value diversity. How can you make someone who is really hit hard by the crisis value diversity when it's really about your own family, about your own job? These are questions that will be very, very difficult to kind of understand for someone who is in dire need of a job. And
that's true. It's extremely difficult, and I think role of education in more wide situation is very important. I think that the question asks about should racism be taught at schools. I don't know necessarily racism, but I think tolerance and human rights and value for human life is something that is absolutely a necessary part of any curricula at school, as much as history. We in Europe should know better than we seem to do what exclusion, what hatred can do, and what it can lead the society into. And I think that's something that should very much be emphasized. But how can we fight racism? I don't think one can fight racism as such. I think what one needs to do is fight the root causes of racism, because racism comes from somewhere. It comes from the hopelessness, and it comes from the fear, and it comes from the despair that people are feeling in the time of crisis. And I think that's what we could do, and that's what we should do. We should fight unemployment, we should fight social exclusion, and we should fight all the problems that create inequality in our societies. And that's the only way to actually answer the root causes, which then give rise to racism. But I would also widen that a bit. The workshop, I wasn't actually part of the workshop because I was speaking somewhere else, but would have very much wanted to be in here what the discussion was more thoroughly, because the problem we have at the moment is for sure xenophobia and racism in Europe, but it's hatred more widely as well. It's not only for those who represent different race or come from a different country, but it's also for minorities, be them sexual or gender or people with disabilities and so forth. And the very scary part in the past 6 months has been shown that it's not only those in the minorities, but it's also those who defend those in the minorities and who want to build a more open, tolerant and multicultural society. As we could have seen in Norway in this summer, which was the attacks in Utoya were absolutely horrific and something that we should never forget. But it's not only in Norway either. And let's not think that this was just one individual who was sick and did something. It was based on ideology. There's a network of people sharing this ideology. There are attacks elsewhere. We have had 2 attacks in Germany against social democratic youth organizations. We had, a few weeks ago, in the anniversary of the Crystal Night, a youth house owned and operated by a German social democratic youth organization was burned down to the ground by a far-right extremist organization. This is something that is very worrying. It is something that should be absolutely condemned, and it should be something that we should put more emphasis and we should give it more room and we should talk about it more in a society, because it's the only way to avoid going back to 1930s and what follows from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kaisa. Raikwan was nodding there, so I'll probably bring you in with your view. Yes?
Yes, I come from an island where everybody who lives on it historically and traditionally were Christians, and yet the hatred between two different Christian sects has lasted for 400 years. And the tragedy is that it's a divided society, and even though we have got peace and there's no longer the violence that caught the headlines right across the world, there are young people, 15, 16, 17 years of age, who've never heard a gun fired in anger or a bomb, and yet their hatred for other people, particularly, it's a combination of ignorance and fear compounded by bad education. And attempts to integrate people or to mix them have not really been that successful. And sadly, the extremism has driven out the middle ground. Our party, sister party, the SDLP, and John Hume, who actually created the model that is now the template for success and for peace in Northern Ireland, they have been displaced by Sinn Féin, who were the IRA. And on the unionist side, the Centre Unionist Party has been displaced by Dr. Paisley's party. So extremism at one level has kind of been institutionalized. Yes, there's no longer the violence, but there is still this division. And attempts to integrate education, for example, or integrate society are not meeting with success. I don't know, Zlatko, if you want to talk about, I mean, your country is unique in this respect, but ending the violence is the first step, but ending the violence is not necessarily the conclusion. You still have work to do.
Yeah, thank you. And Zlatko, you were about to jump in at this
Well,
point.
I think you just completely turned what I wanted to say by right point, and I want to thank you for this. I mean, because I'm coming from the country where 15 or 16 years ago the war was stopped, thanks to the international community intervention. The country was divided. Just for reminder, Bosnia and Herzegovina is a little country, 4 million people. 2 entities, 3 different ethnic groups, major ethnic groups, and 4 world religions historically being there. The war was stopped. The war was stopped by pleasing ethnical warlords. And the system was made for them. Now, 15 years after, when a party like us, Social Democratic Party, the only party in Bosnian parliament since the beginning, since 16 years ago, the only one, whose members of the parliament are Serbs, Bosniaks, Croats, Catholics, Muslims, and Orthodox, and Jews. If we are sometimes treated by right Europe, which is, as far as I'm concerned, wrong Europe, when we are treated as a problem, because for 15 years everything was okay until we won elections a year ago, because it was easy. You have 3 ethnic or tribal leaders, the system was designed for them, and now someone is talking about inclusive society, about shared society. Today, when more than 90% of the countries in the world have more than 10% of the people who are mathematically speaking some kind of minority. And that number is growing. And it was 90 years ago, it was different. 10% of the countries in the world was having maybe more than 10% of mathematic minorities. And that number is going to grow in our direction, in diversity direction. And if, in my country, if 500 years ago, we lived under the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, as Muslims and non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, in totalitarian occupation, and we lived in one society under those historical circumstances. Then we lived in one society under Austro-Hungarian Empire, in one society, being different, but being in one society. Then we had the communist regime, and we lived in one society. And 20 years ago, we started living in democracy, and someone is telling us we cannot live in one society. So what is the wrong? Do we have to go back to Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian occupation or one-party totalitarian system in order to live in one society? That's not what we want to accept. But my point is, besides the point that we have to be louder, is that we have to go on their arena and tell them economy and growth is not your arena, it's our arena. Because that's my second and I think major point is that
if you can keep it brief, because we have
what I'm trying to say is that shared society is economically beneficial. That's the point. Shared society is economically beneficial, and we have to be hitting them more with that voice, with data, with knowledge about it, and spreading that idea. That is so clear that that is the fact. And actually, growth with inequality is going to end as what we had in financial crisis, where comparison to us, growth is not our alternative. Growth is result of fairness. An alternative to fairness is their growth, which is actually greed. And greed is leading us to the exclusion, to the division, to the segregation, and that's not what we are about, wherever in the world we are.
Thank you. Thanks for this intervention. I realize that we are already running out of time and we haven't even touched upon massive questions of health and pensions, but I want to challenge the panel, which is I hope you want me to do, and just put a very bold question, and whoever wants to respond to that, and that is, well, how do we still afford health systems that are social and inclusive? In some countries, we're on the verge of seeing collapses already of health systems. So who can come up with a response to what the health workshop put to us? And that's a quote: fiscal measures among other disease prevention measures offer government a way to change health behaviors. So there's lots of discussions, I guess, in that workshop. Rory Quinn, you're nodding. Would you like to?
Well, Europe has a problem of a growing and aging population. I mean, when Bismarck in Germany and when Lloyd George in Britain introduced the old age pension, the qualifying age for a man to get the old age pension in Britain and Ireland in whenever it was 1908 or 9, the qualifying age was 70, but the life expectancy was 72. So it was actuarially quite manageable. The figures have changed totally, and I think it's not my area of speciality, but I think we have a major challenge in maintaining the values of solidarity, but recognizing that the challenge that we are facing is dramatically changed. We are confronted with a problem in my own country where, because of economic reasons, we have to look at all our expenditure. But most old people want to grow old in their own home and not go to a hospital or go to a home in my country. And we have to look at how technology and communications will enable people who are not sick, who are simply old, how they can be sustained in their own homes to maximum effect. And I think it's the innovation of modern technology and modern medicines, rather than the very expensive cost infrastructure of traditional nursing homes and hospitals and the rest of it. Some medical expert friends of mine say that in 50 to 100 years' time, we will be looking back and wondering, why did we put so many sick people into hospitals, that it was a barbaric way of treating people. I think the concept of the welfare state, the concept of solidarity, the values of support have not changed. But the delivery of the support system, quite frankly, has to change, because the present model is becoming more and more expensive, and the ratio of working people to people who are outside the labour market, the ratio of dependence upon the active labour market force is going to increase, and it will become a burden that I don't think we can afford in its present format. But you don't throw the values away simply because you have an economic challenge. You have to look at new ways in maintaining that value and delivering it.
Thank you. Karin wanted to come in at this point. So the question probably being, can we afford to become healthier and older?
We can afford to become healthier and older. We cannot afford not to become healthier and older. We can see that bad health and illness is very much related to social groups. In Stockholm, one can see that in the wealthier suburbs, age-related diseases occurs 10 years later in life than in the less well-off suburbs, or in the poor suburbs rather. 10 years where the cost for healthcare, the cost for medical costs, etc., of course, high. but also the loss of income to society is a cost which is rarely counted. People who are ill do not work. They don't pay taxes. They do not participate. They're not able to participate in society. Thus, we have to calculate the whole cost of increasing ill health and not having a fair distribution of health services and medical services of different kinds in our societies. We have to, as I say, afford to be healthy.
I have Sven Mixer and also Kajsa that both want to comment on this question, and I'd like to ask you to be also brief, because this will be the last interventions as we're running out of time. So Sven Mixer, what's your...
I take 30 seconds to come back to something that was referred to earlier. Actually, when we are saying that the Conservatives, what the Conservatives are promoting is undesirable and even dangerous to our societies, they are saying that what we are promoting is undesirable and dangerous. They have an additional argument. They are saying that it's utopian, that it cannot be done. So I would like to come back to something that Karin already said, that we have to be perceived as being fiscally responsible. But when we say that austerity measures are unavoidable, then they cannot be sort of mechanical across-the-board cuts. They must be perceived as socially just and fair. And the same goes same applies when we look for additional revenues to finance those social programs. They also will have to take into account people's ability to pay, not just go for money. When it comes to the question of health, then I think it was the famous utopian author Aldous Huxley who said that medical sciences have developed at such a high pace that we don't have any completely healthy person on the earth today, which is very true. I think that it's the fundamental question of bioethics today, that actual medical sciences are developing at a quicker pace than our economies. So many more people actually will die of illnesses that are theoretically curable. And that means that actually the only way forward is more solidarity when it comes to financing health. That people perceive the system as fair. I think it's a key.
Thank you, Sven. Kajsa, you have the final.
Yeah, I will be very brief. I think I don't think I have ever heard a socialist or social democratic politician say that we can't afford healthcare or that our healthcare systems are at the brink of collapse. But I have heard plenty of conservative or other politicians say that, and I think that's quite telling as well. I think how can we afford a healthcare system that works? I think it's a question of priorities, it's a question of politics, it's a question of how much taxes do we gather, how much revenue do we gather, and what do we use it for? And that's what the question is about, and then how the system works within that. But it is not about whether or not we can afford something, it is what we want to afford, and what do we want to achieve, and where do we use the money, and how much do we collect it? And I think that's all political. Claiming that we can't afford something is very conservative, not very socialist.
Okay, so that's, I think, a very good closure to a panel of progressive thinkers. We had a very challenging mission, and to forgive us, we jumped between major topics that in itself would have made it easily for 2 and more hours of discussions. We did our best, believe us, and this is also one stone in many that will form the debates that are going on in the party. So thank you very much for putting the questions for the workshops. The results will be really interesting to follow. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to Rory Quinn, to Kajsa Penny, Slatko Lagumja, Katrin Jemkin, and Sven Mixer for joining us here. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for being with us. And we're moving to the next step in the program, as our leaders are invited to sort of slowly find their way back into the plenary. I would like to announce that we had a photo competition, which is entitled Click for Progress, and the challenge was to put on a photo what the photographers thought were socialist values. They did it. I'm sure many of you already passed the photo exhibition, and now is the moment of truth, because we're going to hear who made the race and who actually got the best shot. And I would like to invite Sita Gomay to introduce us to the competition and also to announce the winners of the competition. Sita Gomay, President of PS Women.
Okay.